What's up, guys? Super long and detailed video here. Bottom line up front, the XMR 850 is a very cluttered engine layout compared to the XMR 700. No surprise there. It's got an extra cylinder. It's very well done, a lot of good cooling and stuff, but it's going to be hotter. It's going to be a little higher maintenance. No big deal. If you like these kind of really long detailed videos, definitely consider checking out the Patreon page. I usually only post the long ones on there. And go ahead and subscribe if you like this stuff. I'm trying to get to 100,000 subscribers, so I'd really appreciate y'all smashing that button for me. Alright guys, in this video I'm going to give you a very detailed comparison between the XMR 850 and the XMR 700. First, I'm going to give you a quantity... Freaking ducks interrupting me. First, I'm going to give you, qualitative observations, things that look different, and then we're going to take a bunch of measurements and I'll show you the actual quantitative numbers to show you what changed from this platform to this platform. So this came out late 2023. Can-Am had some lessons learned, and a lot of those lessons have been applied to this thing. This thing came out late 2024. So I've only had one ride on this, but I've been taking it apart a lot, and I'm fairly familiar with the layout, so I'm going to give you guys a comparison. So what I've done is I've removed the engine side cover here, I removed the front of the footwell, and I removed the side cover that's in here. So I removed 3 pieces of plastic from each side of both machines. So let's go ahead and start at the top. The snorkels, I have a detailed video on this, but the snorkels on the new 850 are much larger than the snorkels on the old 700. Particularly the belt cooling. I mean, look at that pipe right there, right? That's the engine intake. There's the belt intake. Look at these pipes. So, significant improvement in belt cooling right off the bat. The radiators seem to be about the same size. You access them about the same way. Now, I think the 1000 radiator is bigger. Again, we're going to take some measurements. So this is just the qualitative part of the video. Okay. Also, looking at the handlebars and stuff, this one has the winch controller integrated. It also has the intelligent engine braking option. You didn't get that on the XMR 700. I'm sure you could add the winch. It's got the little cutout for it, but it doesn't have it from the factory. The engine braking is kind of a gimmick. I keep mine on high all the time, which makes it feel kind of like this one. I think all it's doing is using the electronic throttle body to change your engine braking feel. The way the plastics come apart on the top is a little more complicated. On the 850, you've got this top hat, then you've got this dash piece, where on the 700, you just have a dash piece with a small baffle in there. Mine's all cut up, obviously, because I have risers on it, but that's a slight difference. The airbox is a little different. This airbox just starts here, and then that's the whole airbox. Whereas on the 850, the airbox starts here and comes all the way back to here. This throttle body right there, and this is your big plenum. So this is why you lost all that storage up here, is because this airbox now starts here and goes all the way to here, and you have this big plenum. Whereas on the XMR 700, there's no front cylinder, so your throttle body sits where the front cylinder would be. Okay, looking at the belt box. The belt box in the 850 looks pretty different. It's definitely bigger. It's definitely designed to flow some more air. I don't know if the clutches are different. I'm sure they're tuned differently, obviously, but the belt box is pretty different. Kind of surprised me how different it looks. So there's the 700 belt box for comparison. The next thing you'll notice is all of this heat shielding here, right? So you can't see a whole lot on this machine because the heat shielding. I've pulled this piece of plastic off. You can't see much behind it either. Now, the reason you have all this shielding is because you have a front exhaust pipe coming around and going this way. The XMR 700 is a single cylinder, so you only have exhaust from here back. That means it's kind of a mess under here because of all these exhaust shields. That's the problem with the V-twin and a quad, as I always say. These are your belt snorkels. That's your belt exhaust right there. It goes up, comes up here, makes a U right there, and then it comes back down right here, and it blows on your engine exhaust. So that's similar to how the XMR 700 is set up, except that this is way bigger. You'll also notice down here that you have 2 airbox drains. This is your dirty side, and then you have a clean side drain down here, whereas the XMR 700 only has 1 drain. And look how big the exhaust pipes are. The snorkel pipes are massive. So let me show you what this looks like in that same area. So you see much smaller piping for your belt exhaust. There's your air box with your one single air box drain right there. Not nearly as cluttered up here because the pipes are much smaller and you don't have that heat shield because there's no header. So on the XMR 700 you can see a lot more. You can see where the throttle body is right there. These wires are made in Mexico. This whole area is open because there's no cylinder there. So that's interesting. This is a lot easier to clean. It's a lot easier to access things because the only heat shield's back here. You don't have heat shields up here, which makes it really nice. Another thing we can look at here is the engine mounts. So these engine mounts have been okay. These rear ones, these front ones were very problematic, and I've replaced them with some snowmobile engine mounts. But you can see that Can-Am learned their lesson there, and this XMR 850 has a completely different engine mount setup. So it's fully captured, so even if the rubber fails, the engine can't go anywhere. The bolt passes through the aluminum basically, and the whole structure of the mount, the way it bolts up has all been improved. So hopefully I won't have any engine mount problems with this 850 like I had with the 700. The rear engine mount, similar story. It's been re-engineered, fully captured. So that is very good to see. They've been paying attention and trying to fix stuff. However, this front bumper piece is different. If you look at where those bolts come through here, which bolt this little bumper on, that is a different design than these ones. So these ones have bolts over here, whereas the 700 has bolts kind of in the middle. So these bumper pieces are different between the 700 and the 850. There's my winch solenoid. There's your air box up here with your ignition wires. And again, you can't see a whole lot on this 850 because it's just buried in exhaust, shields, mufflers, and giant pipes. So this is a very cluttered engine, where this is a very accessible engine. Another thing you'll notice is that these shocks are upside down. So these shocks have the body of the shock on the bottom, which is bad for unsprung weight, whereas these shocks have the body of the shock on the top, which is good for unsprung weight. So kind of glad to see that they flipped the shocks the right way over on the XMR 850. Less unsprung weight, it's good for handling, performance, so good to see that. Now we're looking at the shocks. Let's go ahead and look at the front shock on here. You see how much up travel this front shock has? Okay, and that's got the weight of the machine on it. This one's jacked up so we can see under it better. It has a lot less up travel on the front shock, and this is at full droop. So this thing has more suspension travel up front than this one does, and that's because this comes on 30-inch tires, and I guess they were worried it would rub this bar, even though we know running this one on 33s barely rub the bar. So I think Can-Am went a little overkill there, but maybe they're expecting people to put bigger tires, so they limited the front up travel accordingly. We can also look at the drive shafts. They look pretty similar. There's your front drive shaft on the 700. Pretty good angle to it, but it's been working fine. And here's your front drive shaft on the 850. Looks probably identical. The front differential looks really similar between the two. The front axle's definitely bigger. I'll show you that. There's a 700 front diff, 700 front axle. Very tiny axles on this XMR 700, but they've been handling 33s, 32s, no problem. Again, much bigger axle. The front control arms, the upper ones are totally different. The shock goes through here, so that gets the shock mounted lower down. It has provisions for a front sway bar, which the XMR doesn't have. So these arms are obviously compatible with a front sway bar model. I think the lower arms are pretty similar. They bolt to the same locations on the frame, which is very inboard, the single shear setup, which is real similar to what we see on the 700. So the lower control arms might be the same. I need to look at the part numbers and stuff. Upper control arms obviously different, but yeah. All right, so looking at this side of the machine, that's where you start to see the other cylinder. So on this 850, you've got a cylinder here and you've got a cylinder here. It's a full V twin. And then that means the front of this motor is very cluttered. So you got your big dual overhead cam head up here, your exhaust pipe right there. I don't know how you get to that spark plug. If I ever hydrolock it, we'll find out. It'll be a huge pain in the ass because that spark plug is way in there, up under the airbox / plenum. And you got to get that coil pack out, so it's going to be a bear. But anyway, here's your belt intake. This big pipe comes all the way over here and up. It's huge. Get more coolant lines. Again, upgraded engine mount. There's your ECU, voltage regulator. This is technically a rectifier. But yeah, pretty sweet. Transmission looks identical between the two. Made in Mexico, 1000. They actually have the same gearing right now because I put the gears out of this 1000 in that 700 already. But yeah, so there's your V-twin. One thing you'll notice is that it's not like they just added a cylinder. So the timing chain on this motor is right here. You can see it in the cover. Whereas on the 700, the timing chain is right here. So they moved the timing chain around. So it looks like they kind of flipped the engine, if that makes sense. This one's obviously stained nice Rancho clay color, but a lot of the stuff here looks real familiar. This whole layout. Now, one thing you will notice is that there's all kinds of space in front of this engine. So you can get in here and easily access these boots. You can access your starter. You can clean this very well. There's a lot of space in here. You can get to that's your electric throttle valve right there. It's very nice in here, right? You got all this space, good airflow and stuff. If you look up here, there's your ECU, that's the same. But if you come over to this sucker, there's no space in here. This cylinder is in that space. So you're probably thinking, well, where'd they put the throttle body? The throttle body is up here pointing down, which is why you have no storage, because there's a huge intake plenum thing right there. Whereas on the 700, you get a good amount of storage and you have a lot of space in here. You can see it, it's nice and open. This engine has a lot more air flowing through it, so it's gonna be cooler to ride. This sucker is gonna get hot in the summer if you're working it, just because you're straddling a V-twin motor. But yeah, that's just the big takeaway, is that this thing is cluttered. It's a little heavier and everything, but because of that second cylinder and the bigger belt piping, very cluttered. However, this belt piping is great. This thing's not gonna have belt issues. It has cooling better than most side-by-sides. This is a huge improvement in cooling over the G2, especially the Renegade. These pipes are twice as big as the Renegade belt cooling, so I don't see having belt overheating issues with this at all. So take a look at how big the muffler is on the 850, and I'll show you the muffler on the 700. It's still a big muffler on the 700, but it's not nearly as big. The 850 has a ridiculously large muffler, but it is nice and quiet considering it's a V-twin, and I like quiet, so that's good. I don't know if it has a catalytic converter. I kind of assume that it does, but I'm not sure. All right, let's go around to the back of these machines. So the back axles are really big. We do have these arched lower control arms with this fancy shock mount through the arm, which is cool. Maximizes travel and ground clearance. Love to see it. Hitch setup looks the same. Rear diff looks about the same. Nice big bump stops, huge axles. The knuckles, we have brakes on both sides on the 850, but everything back here honestly looks pretty similar. It's just bigger axles, bigger muffler, and arched arms. If we come look at the 700, we don't have arched arms. We have these straight arms. You can see my bracket lift there. So there's that smaller axle, single side brake. The diff, I think the diff's the same, not 100%, but yeah, pretty similar, honestly, just a little more ground clearance on the 850 and a little bit longer rear shock. All right, now the part of the video I like, actual data. So this front axle shaft diameter is about 23.66 millimeters. That is a big axle shaft for an ATV. Let's see what this one is. Wow, 20.75. So big difference in axle shaft there. The cups are also significantly bigger. Not really gonna try to measure them. Let's see the rear axle on the 850, a little harder to measure. Rear axle about 25 millimeter in diameter on the shaft. The rear axle on the 700 is 23.8, so fairly close rear axle shaft diameters. The cups are way bigger on the 850, like way bigger. I don't even know if I can get this in here, but we'll try to measure the cup. These calipers really aren't big enough to measure this, by the way, but roughly 82 millimeter cups on the 850. Whereas this little 700, it's gonna be really hard to measure because it's up in the frame. Something around 74 millimeter cups. So that's a real big difference. The rear shock body on the 850, it's kind of a skinny shock, 46 millimeter Showas. And the rear shock body back here, really skinny shock, 38 millimeter, whatever that shock's made by. And let's do the front. .42 millimeter Showa, and back here we've got 38, 39 millimeter. So definitely got bigger shocks, so better damping control, better valving, hopefully. They certainly feel better. This thing looks a lot bigger than this one because it's on 33s and I have the rear lift. That front is actually stock height right now. I'm not sure why it's so tall, but it's just ridiculous. This is a tall machine. This thing got taller, by the way, once I removed the extra rack and the stupid winch mount and stuff. So the 850 tie rods are about 18.7, so let's say 19 millimeters. And the tie rods on the 700 are about 17 millimeter. So they made the tie rods beefier. The tie rod ends, they don't have a nut on the inners, which I think is kind of weird. But I think the tie rod ends have also been beefed up on the 850, which is nice to see. Oh yeah, with the bigger tires, definitely been beefed up. That's very cool. About 14 millimeter, so M14, love to see it. Whereas the tie rod outer end on here is 12 millimeter. So that's a big upgrade. So they've made a lot of upgrades between the 700 and the 850 1000 platform. Bigger axles, bigger tie rods, bigger belt cooling, better shocks. So there's a lot of meaningful upgrades. Let's talk about price. 10,500 MSRP, 15,000 MSRP. And if you want the 1,000, it goes up to 16,600. So big price difference between these two. And that price difference is justified. A lot more engineering on this thing into the cooling system, into the drivetrain, better shocks, etc. From one edge of the reservoir to the other, 15 inches. And then from top to bottom, it's about 11.5 inches. So 15 by 11.5 for the cooling fins. And this XMR 700 is 14 inches by about 11. So do have a slightly larger surface area radiator on the 850. Now this thing has never overheated. Radiator's gotten pretty dirty and it worked just fine on the 700. I'm hoping the 850 is just as good, but every Can-Am 1000 I've had, and this is my fourth one. I say 1000 because this is a 999cc motor. Every big V-twin Can-Am I've had has had overheating issues. Actually, scratch that. Even my 570 had overheating issues. So every single V-twin Can-Am I've had overheated from the factory. So hopefully they've sorted it. This radiator is very high flow. It's very up high and will stay clean, but Can-Am doesn't usually put enough cooling on their V-twins. So hopefully they've learned their lesson. What does scare me is the coolant lines are kind of small. Where can we see them? Oh yeah, it's up here. That's one of the coolant lines right there, this guy. The coolant lines aren't much bigger on this 1000 than they are on this 700. And they're also routed totally different. Of course, on the 700, you get both your lines right here. Much simpler coolant routing. All right, now for the part of the video everyone actually wanted to hear, which is which one would I buy? So I've obviously got a couple more quads in the garage, and I've got these two. If I could only have one quad, all things considered, including price, which one would I buy? Based on my 1 day of riding experience with this thing, so it could change, I would 100% buy the XMR 700. Now that's different than anyone else on YouTube. They're always going to tell you that their newest thing that they're excited about is the best because, you know, that's what people do. I try to be a little more objective than that. So this 700 is significantly cheaper. It's going to be significantly easier to clean and maintain because it's got all kinds of space around the motor. It's going to be more reliable because it's got less power and torque going through a similar transmission, a similar belt drive, similar differentials. And yes, the axles are smaller, but I've never broken one. So over a year of abuse on 32s and 33s, and it has all 4 stock axles on it, even with me frequently using the differential lock and beating the crap out of it. I like the front bumper better on the 700. I like the steel rack better on the 700. I like that it's lighter weight. It just doesn't have a lot of the gimmicks that this thing comes with. But the biggest reason I'd probably pick the 700 over the 1000 is heat. So this thing is going to be hot to ride in the summer. You've got this big exhaust pipe that's going to wrap all the way around the engine, around your leg. It's going to be hot. There's no two ways about it. I have never noticed the engine heat on the 700. So in 2 years, these will probably both be sold and I'll have a brand new 700. The 700 has had enough power to get me through everything and it hasn't killed me. Whereas this thing has way more power than I really need. And I do have a lot of riding experience, but very seldomly do you really need more power than that. This thing will be more fun in some situations, but is it worth all the complexity and how cluttered it is and the heat issues and all the weight? In my opinion, probably not. 99% of people would be better off on the 700, including me. Test fitting the 32s for the first time. These are 32 Aztecs on 5+2 method wheels. And on the right side, at full lock, we have some slight rubbing just on plastics that could be trimmed. But on the left side, it totally clears. So they've definitely improved the tire clearance a little bit because on that thing, you had to do some trimming to go to full lock. One thing that annoys me about these things is that it has 3 drive modes up here with the electronic throttle body. And when you turn it on, it always defaults into normal mode. And you got to remember to put it into sport mode. I like to drive in sport mode at all times to get used to the power delivery, and they like to default back. This one does a similar thing, except that this one sometimes defaults to work mode, which is kind of ironic. You think it'd be similar programming. Oh look, this time it started in sport mode. So yeah, that's a difference between the two. This one will sometimes remember the last mode you were in. This one will not.